And take a look at the opening paragraph of this, with a particular focus on the way that time is handled, the setting, and the narrative voice. Those are the things that are really predominant in these opening sections. We start in the present, briefly, very briefly, for literally 2 paragraphs. We're in the present, the hypothetical present of the text, which is 1935. So it's actually a little bit in the future from when it was written. The important thing that I think is invoked really early on is this communal sense through the narrative voice. When she died, our whole town went to her funeral. The fact that this woman's death is at a communal event shows us that this narrator is part of this community, and that Miss Emily means something quite significant to this town. You know, she is not just any old individual. She has a significance to this town. And the tricky part is that it's not necessarily a good one. When we think of that phrase, she is significant to the town, we are instantly kind of provoked to think of it in positive terms. We think, oh, that's nice. It's not. It's Faulkner, so it's disturbing and ghastly. Those of us who have been looking at gender theory in extension will immediately have some alarm bells ringing in this next sentence. The men, through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women, mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house. There's a very deliberate contrast being established through this sentence, and it is exposing the value system that is patriarchal, misogynistic, and, as we'll see in a second, racist.
What does misogynistic?
Hating women. The values the narrator holds, the ideology and the values that the narrator holds, are the ideologies and values of the town over a series of generations, which don't change in the way that they should. There's elements of change, but not significant and not enough. And so if you look at this description of the men, for this town, she is a memorialization of a lost way of life. And so they are not just mourning her death, they are mourning the way of life that this woman represents to them. And what we mean by that is the Old South. The Old South prior to the Civil War, really. Prior to the Civil War, before the outlawing of slavery, before the change of the 20th century that brought with it, you know, a kind of market economy and commerce and greater, but not real, sense of equality between races. This woman, Emily Grierson, to this town represents the way of life before all that stuff changed. And that is why she is a fallen monument. You will see all the way through this story religious language, religious figurative language used to describe her, as if she is some kind of idol or statue or monument. She is frozen by the way that the town perceives her. She is trapped and frozen by the fact that the town sees her as this sort of curiosity in a museum rather than a human being. You know, they use her as a way to capture that sense of the past. Hello, yes. Yeah, I gathered that by you not being here. But thank you for letting me know. Thank you for anxiously testifying to the obvious. So I think there's something really timely about this particular story when we think about some of the things that were happening over the summer in the States around the issues of statues memorializing the Confederacy. You know, this woman, Emily Grierson, in this story is basically a metaphorical monument to that outmoded way of life and the value system that it underpinned it. The women, however, just want to see the inside of her house. So there is an ironic juxtaposition here between the way that men and women are described, showing that women are, in this society, fairly inferior, trapped within the the idea of domesticity, and that they aren't given any sense of intelligence. They're purely as gossipy little witches to see what her house was like. And so we've got within the first sentence, we've got a potentially racist, misogynistic narrator telling us the story. Yeah. And the racist part comes next, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in the last 10 years. If you look here at this little part of the description, the narrator can't really come up with the appropriate terminology for who he's talking about. He's talking about Tobe, the domestic, the servant of Emily. But if you look at the way he is stumbling over the terminology to describe who this person is, I think it's almost like, someone in this particular era that is deep down a bit racist, but knows that they're not allowed to say it because it's not PC. That's kind of what this narrator seems to be doing here. He's trying to work out what the sort of acceptable way of describing Tobe is in the present, in 1935. But he's still clinging on to the value system of the 1840s. And so he's calling an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook. He wants to say slave, I think. The subtext, the thing that's not being spoken there is slave or domestic or the help. All of those extremely derogatory phrases that would be used for black people in the South before slavery was outmoded. And so within one sentence, look what we've got. What we've learned about this narrator in a single sentence. That we're attached to a way of life that is built upon one of the great shames of human civilization. A limited position for women and an attachment to racist stereotypes. So this narrator is highly dubious. This is a dubious, unreliable, slightly unusual, weird narrative voice that is an individual and not an individual simultaneously.
I have a question. I did not understand how they see Emily Grierson. Like, they see her as the past, like in a good way or in a bad way?
I think that will make more sense when we get to this third section. This third paragraph here will give me an opportunity to explain exactly that, because it's quite complex. It's a sort of good and a bad thing at the same time. And that's why it's difficult to get your head around.
Is the narrator the author, or?
No, most definitely not. This is one of those instances where the person telling us the story is actually, I think, being attacked by the writer. The tone of this story, the writer's attitude towards the material is critical. Faulkner is not some wild, racist writer. I don't think. Other people have made a case for it. But what I think he's showing us is an odd, hostile value system through the lens of the narrator. You think of Edgar Allan Poe stories that give us the experience of nightmarish kind of gothic stuff through the lens of psychopaths. We're given stories through those unreliable narrators, not as a way of saying, well, isn't this guy cool? Isn't this bloody lunatic with an axe a fantastic chap? It's a way of saying, well, look, here's what it looks like to a maniac. Here's what it looks like to this society. Here's a narrative voice that captures all of it simultaneously. This next section is really concerned with the setting. It's really concerned with the place that this story's set in, and Emily Grierson's house. It was a big, squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select street. So this opening sentence of the setting gives us an awful lot of information about the setting itself, but also the way that the town views this family. This is a very deliberately grand house falling into disrepair. It's falling apart. It is a monument itself to what we would call the era before slavery was banished and made illegal. This house is built on slave money. It's the reason for its grandeur. It's cupolas and spires. Think of things on the top of a church. This is on the top of this house. and scrolled balconies with kind of scrolling ornamental details. This is a huge, big white house. It's built on the style of the 70s, the moment immediately after the Civil War, where I think there is this last effort to ostentatiously display the wealth that had been gained through the slave trade and through the plantation system. And that's why it had once been our most select street. It is a lost glory prior to the destruction of slavery. And remember, when we say the destruction of slavery, we mean the destruction of the entirety of the economy of what would have been, had they won the Civil War, a separate country. The Confederacy, had it become a country, its economy would have still been based on this particular setup of the exploitation. And so when we say, of a lost era, it's not just, slavery didn't exist. It is the entirety of their model of the economy was destroyed, rightly so, in one fell swoop. The phrase heavily lightsome, I think, is particularly interesting in this because it's paradoxical. It's very difficult for something to be heavy and light simultaneously. But what I think it gives us a sense is the way that it's almost straining hard, it's trying hard to seem light and pleasant. It's trying really, really obviously to look innocent through its whiteness and to look grand through its structures and its ornamental detail. But that is to hide, I think, the sort of dark subtext of that underpins its existence. The dark subtext of slavery and exploitation that has made its existence possible. And that is why it is heavily lightsome.
So can you repeat this?
This particular section.
Yeah, the paradox.
Think of the style of this house in terms of grand and seeming to be pleasant, but almost as if it's trying too hard. It's trying too hard to seem nice. And that's what's heavy about it. It's heavily lightsome. It's almost thick with details that make it look pleasant. It's trying very hard to display positivity, to make itself look pleasant, to make itself look wealthy and innocent and positive. But it's heavy with the details of that because it's trying too hard. It is attempting to mask its negative underpinnings, the things that allow it to exist. But then garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the august names of that neighbourhood. In that sense, august means worthy of respect, venerable. But garages and cotton gins are the signs here of technological advance. They had encroached, they had invaded the space. They had brought modernity, new modes of having to live with them, and obliterated the respectful names of that neighbourhood. Change destroyed this idealised past that the town is so reluctant psychologically to give up. We think of the hostility to technological advance perhaps as being the ending of Kew Gardens. There is a similarity between these two stories. Kew Gardens, we've got the advance of technology as something that has brought us war and something that has brought civilization into conflict, and that the story itself is a deliberate attempt to evade even engaging with it, that we see in that final little section where we have the omnibuses and the rattling steel and all of those noises of the city in that final sentence of Kew Gardens. That story is about trying to evade technological change, the modernity itself. This town is also similarly reluctant to engage with modernity. But I think Faulkner implies that it's much more of a problem than Virginia Woolf. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. So Miss Emily's house is the only thing left that shows evidence of the previous way of life. It was only her house that was left that seems to be clinging on to the past. And then it's personified. It's lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay. Coquettish means sort of flirtatious. that's flirting and tormenting the town with its decay. It's a reminder that that way of life is dying, and it is stubbornly almost tormenting the town with that reminder. And stubbornly. And it becomes an eyesore among eyesores. It's an eyesore, the house itself, because it's a reminder that that way of life is dying. But it's an eyesore among eyesores because the other things in the street are a reminder of change. They are gasoline pumps, cotton gins, garages. They're all signs that basically the slave economy has collapsed and that modernity and capitalism and the free market are properly penetrating this particular part of the world. But the town is not super keen on this. And now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names, those respectful people, usually slave owners, where they lay in the cedar-bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous graves of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. She's died. That's the literal subject of this description. She's died and she's been buried in a graveyard that is filled with the dead bodies that fell in the Civil War. That's what the Confederate and Union soldiers are, the two sides in the American Civil War. There are so many of them. The cemetery is cedar bemused. Cedar is a type of wood, and being bemused means that you are almost overwhelmed and confused. There are so many graves in this graveyard that the cemetery itself is overwhelmed and confused by the sheer number of them, and the fact that they come from both sides. They're both ranked and anonymous. And so what we've got here is the sense of distinction that you see in the setting, that it is lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and gasoline pumps, being destroyed. She used to be superior, and her family used to be from the highest echelons of this society. But she's died, and her sense of distinction has gone. She is, with both sides of the war, in ranked and anonymous graves, people that were worthy of being named at their death and people who were just buried and no one had any idea who they were. She's in there amongst all of that. Her sense of distinction has collapsed in death. And so what we've got there is that moment of change, that moment of transformation, that the town has a hostile attitude towards this woman because she is superior. She seems superior and it's unfair to them. And yet at the same time keeps her frozen in that superiority because it represents a value system and a way of life that they are still to some extent attached to. And so she becomes like a monument, a museum piece. She's a fascination, not a human being. And this is where we see this a lot more clearly. What you'll notice here is we've got another jump back in time. First two paragraphs, 1935. Third one, 1894. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care. I've taken a leap of 40 years backwards in time without any warning. That's why this story is difficult to read. Because you think, hang on, where are we now? What's going on here? And this is the only rare place where actually they state it. The narrator tells you. Alive, she had been a tradition, a duty, and a care. So she has been something that the town sees as one of its own traditions, that it has a duty to protect and to care for. They see her as some sort of burden and a responsibility, and something that is based on a traditional ritual, that they have to preserve her and look after her and keep her in the manner to which she is accustomed. And you'll see what I mean by that in this next section.
Is she more of a burden or more of like a living legend?
I think the second one. I think the second thing, that they see her more as a living legend, but they talk about her as a burden. And you'll see what I mean now. She's a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town. It is an inheritance of its previous values. She is an obligation on the town. The town owes her something, but it also wants to keep her frozen in the past. This paragraph explains the mechanics of how that occurs. Dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, notice who he is and his position. He is an old Confederate general. He is an old military man from the Civil War, probably, who is the representative, the civic embodiment of the town itself. So we've got some slightly unusual values being suggested there. We've got someone who's fought for slavery as the representative of the town. And then he goes on to make this clear, if we hadn't noticed that already. He who fathered the edict, who brought the law into existence, that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron. That black women, A, shouldn't really be in public, and B, if they are, they need to be reminded of their domestic inferiority. You can't be in the street and make it look like you're just an ordinary citizen. You need to be reminded that you are a second-class citizen, even though slavery is abolished. So this is the man who is nice to Emily. And look at the construction of the sentence. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sartoris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes. That little phrase left right at the end of that multi-clause syntactical structure. The nice bit, the supposedly nice bit, right at the end. Look at all this horrible stuff that he did, then this tiny little claim to be positive. He let her off her taxes. And this is what we mean by them trapping her in the past. He remits her taxes. What we're seeing at that moment, I think, is what we would call an invocation of Southern gentility. You know, when you think about the South, one of the things that the South identifies, if people identify themselves consciously as properly Southern, you know, they think of themselves in those terms, as distinct from the North, what their manners and their politeness are something that comes up very frequently. You know, it's part of the social norms of this particular part of America. And here it is. Here's the chivalrous gentleman doing something for a lady in distress. She has been left with no money by her irresponsible father, who has died. The town is going to let her off her taxes so that she can keep pretending to be rich. He remits her taxes. But look at what Faulkner is saying, I think, about Southern gentility. It is at once giving, viciously racist and violent and misogynistic on the other hand. So yes, he'll let the damsel in distress who comes from an aristocratic family, or seemingly aristocratic family, off of her taxes, at the same time as he's going to be making it a law for people to be, if they're black and female, to be seen as inferior in the street. So yeah, he seems polite, but there's a vicious, brutal side underneath the surface of this Southern gentility. And the final clause in that sentence is the dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. And I think the alliteration that's in this sentence is deliberate, highly emphatic of a little section that could function as a metaphor for time in the text itself. A dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. This edict, this law that he has brought into being, this clause of legislation that she doesn't have to pay her taxes, is a way of saying to her, you carry on pretending, my love, that you are still a wealthy, aristocratic, previous, sort of slave-owning, plantation-owning woman. Even though you're not, we're going to keep you in that past. That's what he means by keeping her in the past. Through an action of seeming beneficence, of kindness. I'm going to let you off your taxes because your father dominated your life and left you with nothing. So we feel some empathy for her as we find out more about her family. But it's going to go on forever. It is on into perpetuity. So this dispensation dating from the death of her father will go on until she dies, which is where the story begins.
Isn't this strangely pro-woman, strangely because of this
Absolutely. Faulkner's story is quite, I think, critical of patriarchy, but the values of the narrator are of that system. And you'll see that more as you go through. You know, there is a lot of empathy created for her, even though she's a murderer. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity, which sounds, again, like an element of this southern politeness. Oh, well, no, I can't accept your kindness. Because obviously accepting it is an implicit acceptance that she's no longer superior. And so what looks like here, kind of graciousness and politesse, is actually caused by a sense of superiority that the town is helping to sustain. By doing this, the town is keeping her in that imaginary sense of superiority. It's allowing her to delude herself. And she wouldn't accept this because she doesn't want to seem inferior. So, Colonel Sartoris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. So Colonel Sartoris invents a fiction. He invents a story that allows him to let Miss Emily off whilst saving her face publicly. So this is not only allowing her to carry on feeling superior, but it is allowing her to carry on believing that she is economically superior to the rest of the people that she lives with. Because it is simply apparently a matter of the town paying back her father. And obviously what that implies is that her father was so wealthy that he was lending the municipal government money. You know, he's lending the town itself money. And it makes it sound like she is therefore the beating heart of the town. She is keeping it going if her father's had to lend them money. And of course it's a complete fiction. It's not true. They feel sorry for her and they want to keep her in the state of living that she has been used to her whole life. And so they let her off her taxes to keep her in that state. The final sentence is pretty damning, though. Only a man of Colonel Sartoris' generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. This is a product of the previous generation's values and its patriarchy. And we have to wonder whether there's any hostility in the narrative voice to this idea. But then there is also glaring sense of misogyny in that final clause of the sentence, that only a woman would be dumb enough to believe this ridiculous story. So the narrator is both an interested onlooker and empathizes with her to a certain extent, but much more readily identifies with the next generation, who sees this as an outmoded kind of relic. And that's what the very first sentence of the next paragraph makes clear. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. So when the next generation became the leaders of the town, they weren't particularly happy with the fact that Miss Emily was being able to delude herself that she's superior and not go to work and not earn money and not pay taxes, because the town has kept her as a monument to the previous way of life that she represents. This is why the story is hard. You know, you look at this and there's no particularly difficult vocabulary or sentence structures here, but the arrangements, the interpersonal arrangements in this story and the way that the town interacts with Emily and what the narrator represents in that relationship is extremely complicated. And that's what's difficult in this story. So you think of the narrative voice here. The narrative voice is identifying with the next generation more clearly than it does with Colonel Sartoris and Emily's father. The narrator is not necessarily, at this moment in time, of that generation. But at moments, it seems to be. That final phrase, though, some little dissatisfaction, is wonderfully euphemistic. It's like one of those, phrases from that Orwell talks about in Politics in the English Language. They're really royally angry about this. But because they're Southern, they're not allowed to express that dissatisfaction publicly and explicitly. They just have to gossip about each other behind each other's backs because it's not the done thing to do it in public. So the town itself struggles to adapt to modernity, and Emily is at the centre of that failure to adapt. But there is an incredibly gossipy tone created by that opening sentence. The narrator is in some way just whispering about Emily as a sort of interested onlooker, as part of a group of gossipy individuals. On the first of the year, they mailed her a tax notice. So they're now saying she needs to pay taxes. February came and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later, the mayor wrote her himself, offering to call or to send his car for her, and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape in a thin, flowing calligraphy in faded ink, to the effect that she no longer went out at all. And if you look at the structure of that pair of sentences, in each one there is a progressively more advanced technological attempt to bring her into the present. It starts mailing her a tax notice, then a formal letter, then an individual letter from the mayor with a car coming to get her. That car being the kind of final symbol of technological advance. And what she sends back itself is a symbol of her refusal to adapt to technological advances. A note on paper of an archaic shape. I think, what does that even mean? Like papyrus? Like, what are we talking about here? Like a scroll? In a thin, flowing calligraphy. Even the style of her handwriting seems ancient. In faded ink, as if she's only had one ink bottle, and maybe even wrote it ages ago. To the effect that she no longer went out at all. She doesn't leave her house. And so this letter becomes, I think, a symbol of her entrapment in the past, which is depicted by her physical isolation. She doesn't even leave the house. And so she is trapped in it as if she is a museum piece in a museum of what it used to be like here. The tax notice was also enclosed without comment. It is a written version of this. You can shove your tax notice where the sun doesn't shine, is effectively what she said.
Was the time frame?
1925. So we're 10 years before her death.
So we're bouncing.
We've gone 1935, 1894, 1925 in the space of one page, which is why it's tricky to follow. And then we get the reaction. That is the most dense bit of the whole text, by the way. This is absolutely packed with information. And when you read Kew Gardens, you read it and you think, God, there's a lot in here. That was difficult to read. You read that and you might not necessarily even notice half of the things in that. You still think, oh, that was okay. Yeah, I kind of get it. I'm a bit confused about where the hell I am. But there was nothing in there that leapt out at me as being difficult or significant. It's filled with it. And Faulkner's good at this, like sneaking in implied meaning almost under the radar in a way that you don't even appear to notice a lot of the time. The town is annoyed. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. It's all of the religious figures actually in the town. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door through which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving china painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. So no one has been in this house for 10 years, 8 to 10 years he estimates, in 1925. So the last time anyone's been in there is probably roughly 1915. And so this official group of people come to get hold of her. And she is very evidently socially alienated. You think of the types of alienation in Kew Gardens. They're much more subtle and actually prevalent. In Kew Gardens, everyone's alienated from the other person. Here, she is distinctively alienated socially from the town and the narrator and what he represents or she represents. We don't really know. I get the feeling it's a male voice just through the sheer hostility to women. Since she ceased giving china painting lessons 8 or 10 years ago, it is not a throwaway detail, this. China painting is a kind of dead art form, and she does it out of economic necessity. So it's a sign that A, she herself is kind of like a dead art form, and that B, she needs more money than she has.
She herself
Is kind of like a dead art form. It's a dying art, China painting. Just like her and her life and her values, or what the town believes are her values. There's an awful lot of grim foreshadowing that comes here. They were admitted by the old Negro into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. There is an enormous sense of foreshadowing, obviously, of the conclusion here, which is that there's a dead body in there. But there is always a sense of the fact that the town are sort of aware that it may be the case. The narrator never comes out and says, oh yeah, we were aware she killed her boyfriend and that she'd been harbouring him there for 20 years, 30 years. But there is a sense that something wasn't right and that they kind of knew it and just left her to it. And so the smell of dust and disuse, this is 10 years before they discover the dead body in her house. It was a close, dank smell. It's a corpse that they can smell it. The Negro led them into the parlour. It was furnished in heavy, leather-covered furniture. Again, it's no throwaway detail. This is the old-fashioned furniture of a previous generation. When the Negro opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked and that it's falling apart. And when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray, as if no one has even used the chairs. She doesn't even use her own sitting room. There's a dust that rises sluggishly, and that reluctance to move almost seems like her. And the setting itself is revealing how kind of trapped in the past she is, and that the town has forced her to be.
So the house is also a symbol of her.
Absolutely. The house is even more powerfully symbolic, I think. One thing you have to be careful of when you use that terminology is that a setting can have symbolic properties, but most of the time it's not usually a symbol. It can be, but it's rare that you can call a setting a symbol. It can embody something, but usually the more precise way of talking about it would be to say that it has symbolic properties. It does symbolize, it does function like a symbol, but because it's the setting at the same time, you don't want to confuse the terms. This is a really, really important detail in this final sentence. On a tarnished gilt easel before the fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. So, the tarnished gilt easel, the stand that this painting is on, is both gold, but it's destroyed. And that contradiction, a sort of paradoxical quality to that description, again captures that sense of previous wealth that has decayed. But the portrait itself is also a symbol of her father's control and dominance over her in life and in death. He is there staring over her in this portrait every day that she lives. He is the reason that she is so vulnerable. He leaves her with nothing. They rose when she entered, and this is where we see her first. A small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt. This is an important symbol. It is a watch. It's a timepiece. But we never see that. It's a chain that just kind of disappears into the flabby folds of her body. And so what we get is that she has a vague awareness of time passing, always. There is a watch on her somewhere that we can't see. And so she's conscious of time's passage, but also at the same time trying to deny its presence. She's constantly being reminded of the advance of time through this symbol. but at the same time, you can't ever see it. And so it shows us the way that she's trying to, I think, evade it. Her skeleton was small and spare, so she's got a very small little frame. She's a little person, little frame. Perhaps that was why she would have been merely plumpness. What would have been merely plumpness in another was obesity in her. And so think about the narrator here. This is extremely bitchy. This is an extremely bitchy thing to be focusing your attention on. The subtle nuances of why she's fat. Not just, oh yeah, she was carrying a few pounds, so you could do with a jog or two. No. She was extremely fat because she was so small. It's a way of saying you're both a dwarf and a fatty at the same time. You know, there's a real nasty hostility, I think, that doesn't come across immediately. But when you think about the reasons for focusing on this here, give you that awful sense of hostility and almost bile, that unbearable sort of vitriolic animosity that this narrator seems to display towards her. He can't escape the lens of seeing her through a construct of the Southern Belle. And this is the important thing here. The Southern Belle is the idealized, passive, innocent, beautiful, sort of vaguely intelligent, but not too intelligent to actually threaten your domination as a man, embodiment of femininity that would be associated with this value system. And the narrator is, because she is treated as the remnant of the past, is expecting her to look like that. But of course she doesn't. She's been trapped in her house for 40 years and hasn't left. She's not going to be, shredded and ripped if she hasn't moved.
Mr. Bergman, she was trapped.
She just doesn't leave the house. Partly because she's got a dead body in there. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water, and of that pallid hue. And this is, I think, a really kind of haunting image here. And simile of stagnant water, obviously, relates to her refusal to adapt to modernity. Water that doesn't flow becomes stagnant, as has she. But, her house and her life is outside the flow of time. But there's also a grim, deathly quality to this image. A long body submerged in motionless water with a pale hue, a pallid hue. It's a corpse, a dead body. That's what it looks like and sounds like. And that's what they're saying she looks like. She looks dead. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like two small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stayed their errand. This is kind of how my face looks. It's got big cheeks and tiny little eyes, like as my face gradually swallows them. That's what she's describing here. Is having a big, kind of puffy face and tiny little beady eyes because her cheeks are so fat they're kind of swallowing. And again, all of the figurative language that's cropping up here, similes, left, right, and centre, are to describe how ugly she is. But they're also, importantly, images of domesticity. Two small pieces of coal used to make the fire, pressed into a lump of dough used to bake the bread. The language of this simile is housewife, because that is her only possible fate without marriage, without marrying someone, without being left a fortune. She can only live in the way that she does, which is inside a house. She did not ask them to sit. Failure of southern politeness. The narrator's expectation of gentility is disappointed here. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. She says nothing for such a long time that she actually saps this guy's energy. And this is always quite hilarious when you see people do that. You've got someone who is trying really hard to get something out of someone, and they say nothing for such a long time that it makes the person speaking feel extremely awkward, and they run out of things to say. I've had experiences like that teaching before. You try about 1 million ways to get someone to understand something, it just doesn't work. Not many, hopefully, but it does happen. And that's what's happened to this guy. He's come to a stumbling halt. He can't think of anything else to say to get her to be cooperative. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. That is a symbol of her declining value. She is an old maid. She has no husband. She is worth nothing because she is defined by time, because she can only gain value by marrying someone. Her voice is dry and cold. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sartoris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves. But we are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff signed by him? I received a paper, yes, Miss Emily said. Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But there is nothing on the books to show that. You see, we must go by the... See Colonel Sartoris. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But Miss... The man that she keeps telling them to see is dead. Colonel Sartoris is dead at the time that she's saying this. And her dialogue, which is filled with these repetitions, I have no taxes in Jefferson, are the key, I think, in showing her, the representation of her stubborn adherence to the arrangement and, as an extension of this, the past and its values.
Symbolizes her stubborn
adherence, sticking to something. She adheres to the tax arrangement that Colonel Sartoris came up with, even though he's dead.
And she doesn't know that.
Well, she's talking about it as if she doesn't. And the past and its values. She is determined to stay stuck in that past, to stay stuck in that moment. And just doesn't respond. Her turns in the dialogue are all non sequiturs. They don't follow what the person said previously. See Colonel Sartoris. That's her final words. Brackets. Colonel Sartoris had been dead almost 10 years. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Tobe! The Negro appeared. Show these gentlemen out. She just kicks them out of her house. She's kind of a badass. She's weird, but she is so not afraid of these guys. She's so utterly unimpressed, not disturbed in any way, and so rigidly adherent to what the arrangement that the town itself has come up with for her, that she's on strong footing. And so what we can see here is, even though a new generation attempts to bring her into modernity, they've allowed her to live this way for so long and given her the legal basis to live this way that there's nothing really that they can do about it. They have created a bit of a monster that they can't get rid of. But it's because at the same time as wanting her to be part of society, they are still attracted to the values that she represents.
Do you think she just ignores, do you think she knows and she just ignores the fact that Colonel Sartoris is dead, or?
She genuinely doesn't know. I think that it's deliberately meant to be uncertain. It is deliberately meant to be ambivalent and ambiguous. You're not really fully meant to be able to work out whether she is mentally unstable or whether she's a little bit deceptive.
Because I thought that maybe the fact that she's ignoring that he's dead is like the fact that she's ignoring that, like, it's not that, like, they're not in the past anymore.
It is, absolutely. I think my own, if I'm inclined to pick one of them, I would say I think she is aware and just sticks to it as a willful self-delusion. She is willfully deluding herself because that is the only way she knows how to live. But the language in the beginning of that second section is of battle. She vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. And this is where the gross bit begins. But look at the language that's described. This is where this gets tricky. Look at the language that the narrator is using to describe the thing that he supposedly doesn't like. This is the language of chivalry and of knights of old. This is as if she has just beaten them in a fight. The language that he uses shows that he kind of admires her for doing it. And so even though he or she supposedly identifies with the new generation and wants her to immerse herself in society, this language that he uses in this opening sentence seems to say something different. Seems to tell us that actually he kind of admires her for being such a stubborn old badass. And that because she represents the archaic, idealized Southern past. And the diction is deliberately archaic. It's horse and foot. It's imagining people fighting on horses. And vanquished is a sort of archaic word for defeating someone in battle. And I think that shows us the narrator's attachment to those values. But what we also find out is that this isn't the first time this has happened. And she's done this 30 years ago about the smell, which was 2 years after her father's death, which is in 1893. So we jump now to 1895. We've moved back from 1925 to 1895. We're back in her dad's generation, the generation of Colonel Sartoris and his minions. It was 2 years after her father's death and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. Homer Barron is the guy that she has a relationship with, kills and keeps in her house for 30 years. And this is what he's talking about. But this hyphenated little interjection here is again showing us the narrator is now part of this generation. Oh, look, now this narrator, supposedly a minute ago identifying with the new generation that tries to get her to pay taxes, is now the one that we believed would marry her, part of the generation of her father. So that's why this narrator is weird. It's a kind of ghostly narrator that just hovers into a previous generation as if it's an individual at the time, hovers into a new one as if it's an individual at the time, goes back in the past as if it's an individual there, and then is also a product of all of it simultaneously. The narrator itself embodies the refusal to forget about the past. After her father's death, she went out very little, and this is because her father has effectively trapped her. After her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, the cheek, the kind of rudeness, but were not received. And the only sign of life about the place was the Negro man, a young man then, going in and out with a market basket. And there's a kind of a sort of beautiful poetic irony here that her only connection with the outside world is through her black attendant, a domestic. He is the only person that mediates between her and the world that surrounds her. But what we wonder then, is he complicit in her murderous act? Does he know about it? I'm sure he can smell this dead body. Is he fully aware of this? Does he know about what she's done? And is he just adhering to what he knows? This gives you a real powerful sense of the extent to which his subordination, his being forced to see himself as inferior, is made evident to us. Because what happens when, the end of a funeral, he just walks out the back door and leaves. He doesn't say anything to anyone. He is so, what we call, acculturated. He has been forced to think of himself as inferior so much that he just quietly goes about his business until she dies. And then we've got the ladies again. Just as if any man could keep a kitchen properly, the ladies said. So they were not surprised when the smell developed. And here's the wicked irony, that their bitchy, gossipy nonsense actually distracts them from the truth. That there's a dead body in there and it's nothing to do with whether a man can clean a kitchen. It was another link between the gross, teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. And this is where the narrator sounds like they're taking great pleasure in the idea of this family falling from grace. They are pleased, perhaps, by the evidence of murder because they see it as evidence of their faltering class superiority. And so we wonder then, do they actually know about it and just leave it unwritten and unspoken because they kind of like it? Because they kind of like the idea that the previously impressive Griersons are represented now by only their daughter, who is a murderer. A neighbour, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old. But what will you have me do about it, madam, he said. Why, send her word to stop it, the woman said. Isn't there a law? I'm sure that won't be necessary, Judge Stevens said. It's probably just a snake or a rat that nigger of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it. Again, he is blinded by racism and becomes, because of that, complicit in murder. He turns a blind eye to the possibility that Miss Emily, previous Southern belle and genteel woman of an aristocratic family, may have killed someone. His first go-to speculation is, it's probably the black guy. He probably just killed a rat or a snake in the yard. Why? Because maybe he wants to eat it. You know, there's this ridiculous sort of primitive stereotype attached to this. And so he is trying to avoid having to confront Emily, because you don't be rude to a Southern belle, do you? That's why he doesn't want to do it. He's trying to avoid having to confront her.
Is the town purely stupid, or they're subconsciously trying to avoid? They kind of know that she killed someone, but they try to avoid that.
I think, as you can see, there's a number of different things that prevent them from embracing the truth here. You know, they claim that they want her to adapt, and yet at the same time seem quite fascinated by the fact that she represents the past. They claim that they, you know, sort of think of her house in negative terms, and they think that it stinks, and yet they're quite happy to blame other people for its causes. You know, they're quite happy to somehow squeeze women and black people in all the time as the causes of all these problems. And so there's a huge element of hypocrisy in the narrative voice, for sure. The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in diffident deprecation. He's extremely polite and shows that he is subordinate to the man and to the judge. We really must do something about it, Judge. I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily, but we've got to do something. That night, the Board of Aldermen met, 3 greybeards and 1 younger man, a member of the rising generation. And so here, this meeting is that moment of transition, of generation. It represented in the composition of who's there. 3 old guys and 1 young man. And remember, we're in 1895 now. This is 30. We're in 1895 now. This is the first time the town tried to do something about her. The generation that were the fathers of the people that turn up in the first one when they try and get her to pay taxes. This is just about the smell, which was 30 years ago. It's simple enough, he said. Send her word to have her place cleaned up. Give her a certain time to do it in, and if she don't, damn it, sir, Judge Stevens said, will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad? Judge Stevens is afraid to confront her with embarrassment because he's attached to this concept of Southern gentility. And because of his attachment to that petty social norm, he ends up complicit in a crime. Because he can't face the idea of telling an old Southern dame that she stinks. He ends up being accessory to murder. He doesn't carry out the murder, but by neglecting to do something about the evidence, he's complicit in the act of conspiracy. So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars. And there's this incredible irony in this simile, that they appear to be criminal, as they are sort of beholden to these old values, while the criminality that is real is being concealed. So the guys that go there to sort of investigate the situation are described as if they're doing something criminal, because they are, because they don't confront the truth. The real criminality is inside. Emily's killed Homer Barron and has kept him in there for 30 years. They're sniffling along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. And so, actually, the huge element of irony here is that their act actually aids her crime. Their act, in the end, allows it to go on for longer and longer. You know, it would be significantly more likely to be discovered had they just not done anything, because the smell would be too bad. They cover the surroundings of a house in lime, quicklime, which is like acidic, corrosive material, and it masks the smell of the dead body inside a house. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso, motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the street. After a week or two, the smell went away. Disappears for 30 years. Because they're too cowardly and too attached to southern gentility to confront her and say, what the hell is going on here? Why does your house smell like a dead body? They're too embarrassed to bring her embarrassment. And again, that simile. She's an object of worship. She's a museum piece, and that's why they can't confront her with embarrassment. You don't kind of disrespect an idol. But she's lifeless also. Idols are statues, devoid of life and vitality and animation.
That's his motion.
Absolutely. And so she's completely lifeless, but at the same time, superior. Look at the language. It was dark and lighted, and Miss Emily sat in this window, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. The description of her body position and her posture is one of superiority, but at the same time, entrapment and frozen lifelessness. They have frozen her in the position of superiority, but not as a human being, as a relic of the past.
And the narrator changed again before he was being very negative of her physical features, and now
she's worth worship.
And this is superiority.
This is a slippery little devil.